Welcome to Living the Smarter Science of Slim, where we provide a scientifically proven lifestyle for long-term health and fat loss by eating more and exercising less, but smarter.
Eat smarter, exercise smarter, live better. I am so ready for that.
Hey everyone, Jonathan Bailor back with another bonus Smarter Science of Slim podcast. And folks, this is going to be one for the ages. We are joined by literally the Michael Jordan of exercise science, one of the most distinguished researchers in the world, literally, when it comes to exercise science. He is both an MD and a PhD. He's got a bunch of other qualifications. He's the co-founder of the Sports Science Institute of South Africa. He's the author of The Lore of Running, which we will discuss today, as well as the book Challenging Beliefs. And he's authored more than 450 scientific publications, and he has more than 12,000 citations. Like I said, he is basically the Michael Jordan of exercise science. Professor Timothy Noakes, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jonathan. That's really kind of you. I don't know what Michael Jordan would say, but it's very flattering. Thank you.
Well, Tim, your work certainly speaks for itself. You've been doing this for decades and are known as an innovator. So if you don't mind, certainly you capture some of this in your book, Challenging Beliefs, but could you just tell us the story? How did you develop such a prolific career in this arena?
Well, I fortunately started knowing nothing. I think I did my medical training, and during my medical training, I realized that I wasn't really cut out to be a practicing doctor because I was much more interested in the science and writing the book rather than learning a textbook of knowledge. So no sooner had I finished my hospital training that I went straight into research. And I was fortunately exposed to some really brilliant minds, particularly Lionel Opie, who was head of our cardiology teaching at the University of Cape Town. And we formed a very strong bond, and it's been that way for the last 45 years or so. So I went into research because I wanted to find out things. And we originally had absolutely no equipment, nothing. And I just knew that we had to look at what was important in the environment. And I fell into studying ultramarathon runners because we had the Comrades Marathon, which had between 2,000 and 5,000 runners in those days in the 1970s. And it was a 56-mile race. And there was no other race in the world that had so many competitors. You must remember this was long before the Ironman came along. And so we simply started studying ultramarathon athletes, and we started studying their nutrition and their fluid balance. And that kind of led into all sorts of other things. So my good fortune was that we had no facilities to do anything. And we had absolutely no knowledge. And we just said, well, there's an open field, let's go for it. And I think I didn't get bogged down becoming an expert in one area and looking, for example, at a smaller and smaller and smaller bit of science. I was really interested in the totality of the field. And that allowed us to be innovative in a whole bunch of areas, and eventually came to the conclusion that the mind is terribly important in exercise performance. And had I been a muscle physiologist or a respiratory physiologist, I would never have come to that conclusion, because I would have concluded that my speciality, be it lungs or heart, was what was central to human performance. But because I had no basis, I looked at the data and looked at all the information, and we just the model got better and better and better, and eventually we realized, well, actually the brain's in charge of everything. So the brain must be the regulator. So I think I was very inquisitive, and I had no training, and I think those were two key advantages that I had in the field.
Tim, it's a bit ironic that oftentimes ignorance can lead to the most revolutionary scientific innovations.
Exactly, because unfortunately what happens in science is that you follow the beliefs of your teachers, and it becomes ingrained in you, and then it becomes dangerous to conflict with them. I was chatting to a guy from Copenhagen, and August Krogh won the Nobel Prize in the 1910s for studies of capillaries, and this guy has discovered that August Krogh was probably wrong. But how do you live in Copenhagen and try to take on one of the greatest scientists ever produced in Denmark? And that's his problem. Everyone else believes something else because Krog told them it's true. And he doesn't believe it. And so he's got a difficult time ahead of him.
Well, and Tim, what certainly you have decades of challenging just what is the tradition and coming at it from a very objective and open-minded scientific approach. It seems that we continue, especially in the area of nutrition, also in the area of exercise, to have the mainstream perpetuate that which was proposed 50 years ago just because it was proposed 50 years ago. How do we make this change? How do we bring the mainstream back up with the modern science of exercise and human performance?
Well, the answer is that we just have to have a lot of funerals. As a great physicist said, that science progresses funeral to funeral. And the reality is that the young people are the future, and we have to teach them what we think is wrong, and say, well, this is why we think it's wrong, and maybe this is a better explanation. I'll contrast two examples. Firstly, the idea that muscles become anaerobic and they cause lactic acid and that causes fatigue, which was what I was taught early on. And I was really one of the first to say, actually, it's more complex. The brain is regulating. And I got it completely wrong, because although I knew the brain was the organ, the explanation I gave was utterly wrong. But the point was, I did say the brain's the regulator, which was the important thing. Now, people might say, well, you were wrong on this, that, and the other. But the key was, I said the brain's what's important. Now, the people who said I'm wrong were the heart specialists and the lung specialists who'd spent their lives in an academic career believing and proving supposedly that the heart or the lungs limited performance. So you had academic egos to overcome. But eventually those people die and this new students come along and that's all replaced, and that's what happens. The problem in nutrition is quite different, because there are very strong commercial forces which are driving what we believe. Whereas if fatigue is caused by lactic acid or caused by the brain, has no commercial value whatsoever.
True.
So there's no commercial interest. But in nutrition, there's massive commercial interest. And industry, as you know only too well, chooses the scientists that will push the industry argument, whether it's the truth or not. And that's what's happened. So nutrition is being directed by industry, not by the science. And that makes it very much more difficult to overturn.
Well, just focusing on maybe what would be a little bit easier, and certainly that which you are most known for, and that's exercise physiology. Could you tell us a bit more about the work you are so well known for, which is that the brain is really the area to examine when it comes to physical performance?
Well, what happened when we started doing our exercise testing, we had the most rudimentary equipment, and so we did the most rudimentary studies. And one of the teachings at that time was that if you take an athlete and you make them run on a treadmill faster and faster and faster, they reach a point where, although they can run a little bit faster, their oxygen consumption doesn't go up. And that is supposed to indicate that the heart has reached its maximum capacity to transport oxygen to the muscles. The only problem was that we did our test with this rudimentary equipment, and we couldn't find this evidence that the oxygen consumption had reached this peak value. It always seemed to be going up when the athletes stopped. So I concluded, well, they can't have stopped because they ran out of oxygen, because we can't see that. And so we started writing papers questioning this idea that you reach this plateau in oxygen consumption. And in 1987, I was invited to speak at the American College of Sports Medicine on that very topic. And I said, something else is stopping exercise. It's not that you're running out of oxygen. And at the time, I thought it was the muscles' contractility. In other words, the muscles were becoming weak for some reason. And then in 1996, I was asked to give the J.B. Wolf lecture at the American College of Sports Medicine. And there, because I wasn't a specialist, I said, what can I give a lecture on that will influence or interest a lot of people? And I said I thought there were 5 areas in the teachings in the exercise sciences which were clearly wrong to me. There wasn't enough evidence. And the first one was that you reach this plateau in oxygen consumption. And the second one was that muscles become anaerobic during exercise. And I presented the evidence showing that that's not the case. And then I had this brainwave, and I said, actually, what's happening is the body is regulated so it doesn't fail. Because these models are failure models. In other words, you get tired because the body fails. And that's completely contrary to the teaching of normal physiology. In normal physiology, and I'm essentially a physiologist, we teach that everything in the body is tightly regulated, homeostatically regulated, so it doesn't go out of certain range of values. But what the exercise physiologists were saying, that's fine at rest, but during exercise it doesn't happen. During exercise, the system breaks down and you collapse. And I realized that can't be the case, and it was very simple. It was simply that I work with heart patients on a regular basis and have done so for 40 years, and we exercise them. And they don't all drop dead, which they should if there's no control. They very seldom have a problem during exercise. So I figured, well, there must be something regulating that. And then, of course, people exercise vigorously in the heat. And yes, some people develop heat stroke, but the vast majority, millions and millions and millions, don't. And so what's remarkable, it's the millions who don't develop heat stroke that's remarkable. It's not the fact that 2 or 3 do develop heat stroke. And then finally, I had an interest in mountain climbing and climbing Everest. And people die on Everest, but the majority don't. And so that there must be some regulator that is making sure that it's safe for you to exercise even at extreme altitude on Everest. So I came to the theory that the body is a tightly regulated system, and the only regulator that we know of is the brain. So I then said the brain must be in control and regulating exercise performance. And that, of course, was greeted with derision by all my colleagues. And eventually, over the years, we expanded the model and were able to show all the evidence in the literature which shows that humans pace themselves. And as soon as you see pacing during exercise, you know that the brain's regulating the system. Because pacing you choose within a few seconds of starting exercise. And that can't be because the muscles have got too much lactic acid. It must be because the brain has chosen to start exercise at that work rate. An even better indicator of this model is that when you get near the end of exercise, you speed up, so you have an end spurt. And how can you end spurt if you're fatigued and the muscles are anaerobic or they've run out of glycogen? And the answer is they can't. It has to be a regulated process. So I think today that most exercise physiologists would agree that it is a regulated process and that the brain must be involved. And the argument is my model of how the brain works correct or not? But we've moved beyond saying it's an unregulated failure process. No, it has to be a regulated process.
Tim, how can we see a similar shift? I love that you use the term homeostatically regulated. I love that we're talking about the brain being in control, and I love that you have dedicated your life to reflecting this proven science in the field of exercise physiology. And I'm curious if you have any opinions on how we can show the similar model, which is being borne out literally every week in research around the weight regulation and nutrition, about the homeostatic regulation, the involvement of the hypothalamus, the involvement of our quote-unquote second brain or our gut bacteria, studies showing that transplanting gut bacteria from one animal into another will make that other animal lean out regardless of the quantity or quality of calories it consumes, parabiotic tests where the introduction of hormones from a lean animal into an obese animal causes the obese animal to lean out, again, regardless of its quantity or quality of calories. And we get this. We understand intuitively that every biological organism seeks out homeostasis in every area of life. But historically, for exercise, before you came around, we ignored that fact. And even currently, in the nutrition arena, the vast majority of quote-unquote experts continue to ignore the homeostatic regulation of body composition. How do we make that shift?
Sure. Well, you're quite right. Until 3 years ago, I knew absolutely nothing about nutrition. It was only when I decided to look into my own weight control and change my own nutrition and started reading that I began to pick up on all the information you have. And I'm certainly not as much of an expert as you are on all those topics. But what is obviously clear is that for 3 million years, humans regulated their weight very carefully. And then it's really only in the last 30 years that the homeostat in the brain has gone haywire. And the obesity is clearly, in my view, due to altered homeostatic control of food intake. And that's the key. It's not even expenditure, because the expenditure is not the problem. And so, for example, the best example I can give is that the Americans certainly are doing less exercise, but it's like about 100 calories, or maybe even it's 200 calories a day less energy expenditure. Now, that cannot cause obesity. It's absolutely impossible for that to cause obesity, because in a homeostatically regulated system, all you do is you just eat 200 calories a day less of food, and so you regulate it homeostatically. So the key has to be that the homeostat has become damaged, and that damage comes with the 1977 dietary guidelines, in which we replace fat with carbohydrate. And my own opinion is, now having read the stories about the Inuit and the Plains Indians in America, and in South Africa, the hunters, particularly the Bushmen, the San Bushman hunters, it's very clear to me that they sought out fat. That was the key that they wanted to eat, was fat. And I think what's happened in the last 30 years, but increasingly for the last 100 years, is that we've replaced fat in the diet with sugar and refined carbohydrates. And I was reading Stefansson's work on living with the Inuit in the 1920s, and he makes the point in his book, The Living Arctic, that the key change, which he noticed already in the 1920s, was that we were replacing fat in the diet with sugar, and the sugar was becoming the driver of our appetite, not fat. And that is my view, that as soon as you take fat out the diet, the homeostat starts to fail for whatever reason. It may well be the gut flora has changed. It may be that that fat acts in the brain in a particular way. But whatever way, we've destroyed the homeostat. And the key is the reduction in fat and the increase in the total carbohydrate consumption, with an emphasis on sugar and refined carbohydrates and flour. So that's the evidence, and the only thing I can say to change people's opinions is, I say we're trying to change one person, one meal at a time. And the beauty of changing your diet to reducing the carbohydrate content and replacing it with fat is that you lose your hunger, and that is what is so exciting for people, is that they can suddenly control their food intake and they're not always hungry. And I think certainly when I was eating lots of carbohydrates as an athlete, I was always hungry. And the food controls your life. It is an addiction. But now I've completely lost that addiction, and I'm almost never hungry. In fact, I'm so unhungry that I often worry, am I eating enough? You know, that's the concern. And by the way, since I started promoting this diet in South Africa and became attached to it, a lot of people have written to me, and in fact, over 100 people wrote to me, and they sent information about themselves, the weight they lost, and how they felt. And I've actually put together a scientific paper, and it's based around 5 case reports where people just had miraculous cures. I mean, they were just absolute miracles. One guy lost 80 kilograms. That's close to 200 pounds in 7 months, and it was just astonishing. And other people cured their diabetes and everything. And I mean, I know Robert Atkins described it in 1972, so we're not describing anything new. But the point was that 100 people, most of them said this is the easiest thing they ever did in their lives. And the key is that they no longer fear food, because they're now controlling the food. The food's not controlling them. And we just have to get more and more and more people to realize that you don't have to be a slave to food. You can be in charge, but you can't be in charge as long as you have eating this high carbohydrate, high refined, high sugar diet.
And the thing that is so profound about that, Tim, and I hope that we are approaching a tipping point, because as you've shown in your work, it's one thing to have a compelling theory. It's another thing to have a compelling theory and be able to show the mechanisms that make it true. And I think that's what you've done so well. And as we get deeper into understanding like the hypothalamic regulation, and when we do animal studies where we show, and animal studies are interesting because it eliminates all these other variables like emotions. And so we can just say in a mammalian model, if we, for example, introduce this one form of gut bacteria, metabolic disorders reverse themselves without any change in the food quantity being consumed. So we start to see there are these underlying mechanisms. When you can start to demonstrate these mechanisms, like it's not just magic. It's not that fat is magical. It's that a diet that is higher in fiber, that is higher in healthy fats, that is higher in protein actually activates different neurological and bacterial pathways, and you're literally making your body work in a different way. And do you think that is so? So the reason I really wanted to speak with you is you are essentially an example of how to convert the scientific community. So maybe could I just try to recruit you to do the same thing for nutrition in the
Yeah, well, certainly in South Africa, I'm known now as the madman. I've completely lost it, as far as some of my colleagues believe. And in fact, they forced a debate on me in December last year, in which my own faculty tried to expose me as a crank. And fortunately, I survived that one. And because I survived, because I didn't lose, I actually was able to get just enough information out to make people start questioning. And in South Africa, this high-fat diet is called the Noakes diet, which of course it is. It goes back, 150 years, so it's certainly not my diet. But I think that South Africa is going to tip in the not-too-distant future, because we also have major obesity, diabetes problems, and we don't have the wealth that the United States has, and we have to address the issue. And we're about to start our own national health insurance, which we've never had. We've never had a national health insurance policy program. And it will be bankrupted by diabetes and obesity. So it's pointless starting it, knowing that it's going to be a failure, unless we address the nutrition. And what I've learned in the last 3 years, and this is completely contrary to what I learned as a medical student, I believe that at least 80% of ill health, chronic ill health, is related to nutrition. And thank goodness for all the Americans who I've read in the last 3 years, who're providing all this information, as you said. I really think America leads the world in the research that's being done in this field and getting that information out. And to me, it's abundantly clear that the gut flora is where the future of medicine lies. And if we don't address gut flora, you can't address most of the chronic ill health. And the model that I was raised on was that there's a pill for every disease, and that just doesn't work. It's all of medicine, chronic medicine that I was taught is palliative. You still die from the same disease. If you have diabetes, you can take your insulin, you can take your glucophage, metformin, you're still going to die of diabetes. You're still going to have the arterial damage. You're still going to lose your legs. And the only way that you might save yourself is by changing your nutrition. And medicine never says that it's a palliative profession. Our patients believe that they are getting better taking those pills, and they aren't. And the beauty of the internet is that in 10 years' time, the whole world will know that medicine is palliative. Yet there are ways you can actively do something for your health. But to do that, you've got to eat properly, and you've got to get away from the addictive foods, as we've discussed.
And Tim, it is a challenging problem because just last night I was digging into the recent research around, I'm going to completely destroy the name of the gut bacteria, so I'm not even going to try to say it, but there's a specific form of gut bacteria that a bunch of researchers out of Belgium have been studying extensively, and they have found just amazing differences between obese mice genetically in both diet-induced as well as non-obese mice in terms of the levels of certain hormones as well as the levels of certain gut bacteria. But here's the challenge, Tim, is if you read the study, and I'm actually going to quote directly here, and then I'll dig into why this becomes challenging. So we demonstrated that confusing bacteria name treatment reversed high-fat diet-induced metabolic disorders, including fat mass gain, adipose tissue inflammation, and insulin resistance. Now, rewind. We demonstrated that reversed high-fat diet-induced. Now, but again, here's the challenge. Even this literature, the high-fat diet they're talking about is the cafeteria diet that is garbage fat. So we still have this challenge of like even someone who is, let's say back in the old model, would read this study and say, well, see, the high-fat diet is the problem.
So, Jonathan, I'm so glad you raised that because I'm going to give you two little stories. I was at a meeting on obesity and genetics in United Kingdom recently, and they were talking about how they were going to change the genes to save us from all becoming fat. And I said, but it's an environmental problem. If you get the environment right, you don't have to change your genes. But aside, and then I said, someone mentioned high-fat rats and so on. I said, but that doesn't apply in humans. If you put humans on a high-fat diet, they lose weight. And the whole audience turned around and looked at me as if I was mad. And so, and I then had to, so they said, who are you? Where do you come from? What are you saying this? You see, so anyway, we sort of settled that down. So then they said, I suppose you're a proponent of Atkins. I said, no, actually, I'm a proponent from Banting halving diet, which was developed in London, right here, because the meeting was in London in 1862. But anyway, the next thing that happened to me, and this is a point that we really need to emphasize, a person from my own university wrote to me and she said she was doing studies on arterial function in rats. She said they could never get their rats fat on a high-fat diet. It was only when they gave them syrup that they got fat. And if you look at the diets that the rats eat, they're usually given sugar, sucrose in water to make them fat. It's not a pure high-fat diet. And I suspect that it's not the high fat that's causing the obesity in these rats. In the rat model, you have to overfeed them on refined carbohydrates and sweet carbohydrates to make them fat. And I suspect, with my long experience, just like the plateau phenomenon in exercise physiology, in 1970, you could not publish a paper if you didn't say that we saw the plateau phenomenon in 100% of our patients or athletes. And we didn't see it, so we didn't say it. I'll bet you that the mythology has evolved, that people are reporting that it's high-fat diets causing obesity in these rats because that was what was said 15, 20, 30 years ago. But they are also slipping in the carbohydrates because the carbohydrates are what are driving the obesity in the rats, not the fat, or not exclusively the fat.
Tim, that's such a key point because, for example, we see all these epidemiological studies that show that, for example, the group that ate higher fat had higher incidences of XYZ disease versus the completely vegan or vegetarian other group. And the key thing to keep in mind is, again, I don't think you or I or any other advocate here is saying eat a bunch of refined garbage fats that also come with them or have with them a bunch of processed starches and sweeteners. That is a completely different high-fat diet than the high-fat diet we're talking about. And to conflate the two of them is just patently wrong. Would you agree?
Absolutely correct. I couldn't agree with you more. And I eat a 70 to 80% fat diet, and I'm the thinnest I've ever been, and I'm back to almost the weight. Well, in fact, I'm lighter than I was when I was rowing in 1972, 73. That was when I was on my peak rowing weight. That's crew rowing weight. I was probably 84. I'm now 81. And I'm slightly heavier than when I was a schoolboy at say 77. And so I brought my weight right back to where I was in my 20s by eating 70 to 80% fat. So don't tell me that fat makes you fat. It's absolutely the opposite.
And it's unfortunate, Tim, because I think we all understand intuitively that the quality of the macronutrient matters, right? Even advocates of a higher carbohydrate diet generally, with a few noteworthy exceptions, say we should get our carbohydrate from certain sources like vegetables and like from fruits, not from refined sugar. And that's definitely different than saying eat a high carbohydrate diet where 60% of your calories are coming from processed starches and sweets. Well, why can't we give the same obvious acknowledgement to when we say eat a higher fat diet? We're talking about eating a natural whole food sources of fats, high in omega-3s, high in healthy saturated fats, high in monounsaturated fats from natural nutrient-dense sources, not the quote-unquote high-fat diet that the average American eats, because one, it's actually not that high in fat. It's sub 50% calories from fat. And two, the fat sources are dramatically different.
No, I absolutely agree with you, and that's the message we have to get out. But the problem I have when I speak about this, and I always say it, I said that I'm three weights. I'm the weight when I have a high carbohydrate diet. I'm a weight much lighter when I have a high protein, low fat diet. And I'm the lightest when I cut the protein and the carbohydrate and eat more fat. And then people just say, but that's not possible because we know fat makes you fat. So we have to get over that one as well. And people are absolutely amazed that the way to lose weight is to eat more of the good fats that we described.
Tim, I think maybe you should quote Ufi Raffenskov when those people tell you that fat makes you fat, and tell them, well, watch out because green vegetables also make you green.
Yeah, I must remember that one indeed.
Well, Tim, I literally have an entire list of questions that we did not even get to because we've been having such a great conversation. So I truly hope we can have you back on the show because your influence, not only me as an individual, but obviously on the entire scientific community is quite legendary, and it's been just an absolute pleasure chatting with you today.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for your incredibly intelligent questions. And let's hope that we can get together again because this message, we have to get this message out. I was, by the way, in New York 3 weeks ago, and one of the guys from Microsoft was speaking, and he said that the United States has to sort out its budget deficit within the next 10 years if it's to survive as a viable nation. And he said at the same time, they have to address the burgeoning medical costs, because unless they sort that out, they cannot solve the budget deficit. So the whole future of the United States of America is threatened by the obesity diabetes epidemic, which is threatened by the dietary guidelines that we are currently prescribing. So we have 10 years to get this message out there and tell people to change their diets.
Tick tock, the clock is ticking, and we've got, but folks, the good news is we have Professor Timothy Noakes on our side, fighting the good fight. So, Tim, thank you again so much for joining us. While it is a little bit bleak right now, I think we have a hopeful future because we have people like you fighting that good fight. So I appreciate it. And let's not forget your contribution as well. So thank you very much, Jonathan. Thank you Thank you, Tim. And listeners, I hope you enjoyed today's chat as much as I did. Please, if you want to get more information on Tim, just do a web search. There is no shortage of information. And his most recent book is called Challenging Beliefs. A wonderful publication. And remember, this week and every week after, eat smarter, exercise smarter, and live better. Talk with you soon.
Wait, don't stop listening yet. If you like the podcast and if there's other ways we can help you, please join us in the Smarter Science of Slim support group, which is freely available at the Smarter Science of Slim website, smarterscienceofslim.com. There you'll find all kinds of free recipes and success stories and just all kinds of fun stuff like how to help your kids go sane and just great community content.
And just one last thing before you go, if you wouldn't mind heading over to iTunes and up onto Amazon.com and leaving us a review, and then going over to Facebook and liking us, we would hugely appreciate it.